She gave him the best words she had for love, one by one, and he used every single one of them to describe somebody else. The night Renee Aldrich walked into the back hallway of the Langford estate on Marlborough Street, she was carrying two things Theren didn't know about: 6 weeks of a secret she'd been learning to breathe around, and a small ceramic mug wrapped in white tissue paper that she'd bought that afternoon from a pottery studio on Charles Street. She was going to tell him. She had rehearsed it on the red line, one hand pressed flat against her coat, lips moving slightly, the woman across from her pretending not to notice. She'd told herself it would be fine. Theren was not a man who panicked. Theren was a man who got very still and very quiet when he was processing something, and then he made a decision, and the decision was always. She heard his voice before she reached the study. She'd taken a wrong turn. The estate's east wing was a maze of dark-paneled corridors she'd learned only partially in 8 months of visiting through the side entrance, the garden gate, the quiet door that let her in without being announced. That was how she moved in Theren Langford's world, carefully, through the back. The study door was not fully closed. Renee? He said her name like he was picking something up off the floor, a mild inconvenience. Someone at the table had apparently brought her up because he answered the way you answer questions about weather, briefly, without real interest. She's not relevant to this. She's a temporary arrangement. I'll handle it after the new year. Someone laughed. Another voice, his father's probably, said something she couldn't catch. Theren said, "Don't concern yourself. She's not part of what we're building." Renee stood in the hallway and did not move. Not part of what we're building. She pressed her back against the wall and felt the wrapped mug through the leather of her bag and thought about the pottery studio that afternoon. The way she'd stood at the window for 10 minutes before going in. The potter, a woman in her 50s with clay-stained hands, had set the mug on the counter and smiled at her. "You look like a woman who just made up her mind about something," she'd said, and Renee had laughed and said yes, actually, yes. She stayed in that hallway for maybe 40 seconds. It felt geological. Then she walked back the way she'd come, out through the garden gate, down Marlborough Street, into the cold November dark of Boston, the city moving around her at its usual indifferent speed. She didn't cry on the train home. She sat with her bag in her lap and her hands folded on top of it and watched the tunnel walls slide past and thought, I was going to tell him tonight. The mug was still in her bag when she got back to her apartment above the bakery on Tremont Street. She set it on the kitchen counter, still wrapped, still in its tissue paper, and didn't look at it. She sat on the floor with her back against the cabinet instead and stayed there until the heat clicked off and the kitchen went cold. She'd grown up in a house that went cold. Her father had left when she was 5, one ordinary Tuesday in March, and her mother had stood at the kitchen window for 3 days before she started moving again. Renee had learned early what it meant to read a room that had been emptied of someone. She'd spent her entire adult life making sure she was never the one standing at the window. That was why she'd been so careful with Theren, so deliberate. She'd watched him for 2 months before she let herself feel anything. She'd cataloged every inconsistency, every sign of exit, every crack in the surface where she might eventually fall through, and she'd found none. She'd found a man who ordered her coffee exactly right, without asking, who remembered the name of the neighborhood cat she'd mentioned once in passing, who drove past her bakery at 6 a.m. On days he knew she was opening early just to text. Lights looked good through the window. She'd decided he was real. That was the mistake. At midnight, she pulled out her phone and booked a flight to Charleston. Her sister Celia had been asking her to visit for 3 months. The flight left at 6 in the morning. She packed a bag and her camera and enough of her recipes to work remotely from Celia's kitchen table. She did not text Theren. She did not leave a note. The mug she put in a cardboard box with the lid folded shut. Celia Aldrich lived in a white row house in Wagoner Terrace with a garden that smelled like rosemary and old brick, and she opened the door at 9 in the morning when Renee arrived without warning, looked at her sister's face for exactly 3 seconds, and said, I'll make eggs. That was how Celia operated. She didn't ask the question that was already answered. She made eggs. She poured coffee. She sat across the table and waited. When Renee finally said, "I'm pregnant, Celia," her sister set down her fork with the precision of someone receiving important information and treating it accordingly. "Okay," Celia said. "I heard him tell his family I was a temporary arrangement." Celia looked at her steadily. "Before or after you told him?" "I didn't tell him." Renee looked at her coffee. "I was going to, and then I heard it and I left." A pause. Outside, Charleston was doing what it did in November. The live oaks going copper, the light coming in sideways through the kitchen window, everything slightly warmer than it had any right to be. Renee had always found this city disorienting in the best possible way. It moved at a pace that made you feel like the world had agreed to slow down slightly out of courtesy. "Does he know about the baby?" Celia asked. "No." "Are you going to tell him?" Renee looked at the window, the rosemary in the garden, the neighbor's orange cat on the fence post. "I'm staying," she said instead. "Can I stay?" Celia picked up her fork. "You could have asked me that on the phone," she said. "Come on, I'll show you which drawer has the good tea." Theren Langford called for the first time 3 days later. She watched his name on the screen and didn't answer. He called again that evening, then the next morning. Then he stopped for 4 days. Then called once more, a single ring like a question he already knew she wasn't going to answer. Renee photographed the garden. She made croissants at 5 a.m. because she couldn't sleep and because making something with her hands was the only thing that quieted the specific noise in her head. She photographed the light off the harbor. She thought about the pottery studio and the woman with the clay-stained hands and what it had felt like for approximately 20 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon in Boston to be completely sure of something. What she did not know, could not have known, was that 4 days after she'd disappeared from his life, Theren had sat in his office on the 42nd floor of the Langford Group building in Copley Square and understood exactly what had happened. His housekeeper had mentioned offhand a young woman in the east hallway the night of the family dinner. Dark coat, bakery logo on the bag, standing very still. He'd asked her to describe the bag. He already knew. He'd pressed both hands flat on his desk and sat there for a very long time. Then he'd called the only person he trusted with something like this, his head of private security, a quiet, methodical man named Theren, who found people the way good accountants found errors, patiently without drama, through the accumulation of small facts. What Theren found 48 hours later was a detail Theren hadn't anticipated. Renee had visited an OB clinic in the South End 2 weeks before the dinner, a first prenatal consultation. Theren delivered this information in 3 sentences and then went quiet. Theren said, "Don't tell anyone." "Of course not." "Where is she?" She was in Charleston. Her sister's house, a street Theren had traced through a forwarded utility account. Theren had the address within the hour. He held it and thought about a woman standing in a hallway with a wrapped mug in her bag and his words coming through a not-quite-closed door. She had come to tell him something essential, and he had taken it from her before she'd had the chance. He flew to Charleston on a Thursday and checked into a hotel on King Street under a name that wasn't his. The Langford name in a city this size would have generated exactly the kind of attention that would make everything harder. He unpacked and sat on the edge of the bed in the afternoon light and tried to figure out what he was going to say. He'd been composing versions of it for 4 days. Every draft sounded like a man trying to win something. He wasn't here to win. He wasn't even sure he deserved to be here at all, but she deserved to know that he knew. That was the only sentence he'd settled on that felt true. He found her on a Sunday morning at the Charleston Farmers Market on Marion Square. She was standing at a flower stall with a bunch of dahlias in her hand, not buying them, just holding them, her camera over one shoulder. She was wearing a heavy charcoal coat, and she looked like she had been walking for a while. She had the look she always got when she was photographing in her mind without raising the camera. He sat down on the nearest bench and waited until she was 10 feet away and said her name. She stopped. She didn't turn immediately. She stood very still, the dahlias in her hand. Then she turned. She looked at him the way she looked at everything she was deciding the truth about. "How did you find me?" she said. "Does it matter?" She set the dahlias back on the display without paying and came to sit on the other end of the bench. She left a deliberate distance between them. He didn't move to close it. "You were in the hallway," he said. She looked at him. "I know you were. My housekeeper described the bag." He held her gaze and didn't perform anything with his expression. "I said you were a temporary arrangement. I said I'd handle it after the new year. I said you weren't part of what we were building." She looked away toward the harbor. "Say it," she said. "Everything you think I heard." He did, all of it, without softening and without asking her to see it from any angle other than the one she'd been standing in. The silence after it was long. "I was going to tell you something that night," she said finally. "I know. You know," flat. "I know about the appointment. I know what you were coming to tell me." He paused. "I'm not saying it back to you now because that's your sentence, not mine. I'm saying I know, and that it changes what was already unacceptable into something I don't have a word for." A mockingbird ran through 4 different calls in the tree above them. "Knowing it doesn't change what you said," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her, the line of her face, the way she held the camera strap, knuckles slightly tight. "Because you stood in that hallway and didn't make a sound, and then you walked out of my building and disappeared, and that silence was the most important thing anyone has ever not said to me." He paused. "I needed to be where you are. I don't know how to explain it better than that." She looked at the harbor for a long time. "Go back to your hotel," she said finally. She stood. "And if anyone from your family comes near this house, they won't." She looked at him once more. Then she walked away. He extended his reservation. 2 weeks. He spent them learning the rhythm of her life in Charleston without following her. The farmer's market on Sunday. The bakery supply shop on Tuesdays. The morning route along the harbor. He held all of it the way you hold something fragile, without squeezing. Then, on a Thursday 11 days in, Oren called. "The family knows where you are. Your sister Adrian made inquiries. She's retained outside counsel." A pause. "Negotiation and private settlement. She's moving to contact Renee directly." Theren was out the door in under 3 minutes. He went to Wagoner Terrace and knocked. Celia opened the door, looked at him with Charlotte's same dark eyes and sharper edges, and held it open without warmth. "Kitchen," she said. "She'll decide if she wants to come down." Renee came downstairs in 2 minutes. Paint-speckled jeans, flannel shirt, the look of someone who had been sleeping badly and knew it. She looked at him and read his face before he spoke. "What happened?" she said. "Not a question." "My sister is moving to contact you through attorneys," he said. "Private settlement. I wanted you to hear it from me." Something shifted in her expression. Not fear. Something harder. Confirmation. "Settlement," she repeated. "That means go away quietly, and we'll make it worth your while." "Yes." "And you're warning me because I'm not going to let that happen." He looked at her directly. "You're not a situation to be managed. You never were. The fact that I let my family see you that way, even for one night." He stopped. "I'm here because you deserve to know before someone shows up at this door." She studied him, looking for where the performance started. "If she sends someone," she said finally, "what are you going to do?" "Deal with it." "That's not specific enough." "I know," he held her gaze. "Give me the chance to be specific." She looked at him for another moment, then, "Go back to the hotel and be specific." The attorney arrived 9 days later. He came to the front door on a Wednesday morning, and Celia opened it. Renee sat at the kitchen table and heard every word, the careful language of arrangement and privacy and comfort and stability, each one a wrapped version of disappear. The word arrangement appeared 4 times. When the man finished, Celia looked at the envelope in his hand and said, You can tell Adrian Langford that my sister is not a complication. She's a person, and she doesn't do arrangements. She closed the door. Renee picked up her phone and called Theren. He answered before the first ring finished. She sent someone, Renee said. 2 seconds of silence. Are you okay? A man just came to my sister's door with an envelope and called my baby a complication. Her voice was ice water at absolute zero. Not anger, something below anger, where things get decided rather than performed. He used the word arrangement. He used it like it was a kindness, a breath. I need to know right now, Theren, not eventually. Are you going to do something, or are you going to keep being sorry from a hotel room across town? He was already in the car. I'm coming. He drove to Wagoner Terrace in 11 minutes. Walked through the unlocked door, found her at the kitchen table, both hands flat on the surface, jaw set, Celia at the counter. Neither of them spoke. He sat down across from Renee. He took out his phone, and he called his sister right there. At Celia Aldrich's kitchen table in the afternoon light, with Renee watching him, and said, I know about the attorney. I know about the envelope. If anyone from this family contacts Renee again, by any means, they are not dealing with her. They are dealing with me. He paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Adrian said, You're choosing a stranger over your family. He looked at Renee across the table. I'm choosing to stop making the mistake I already made once. He ended the call. He set the phone down. The kitchen was very quiet. Renee looked at him, not trust, not warmth, but something underneath both, the first stone of a foundation not yet built. Okay, she said. One word. He nodded. He didn't push it further. The article went up 3 weeks later. A Boston Society blog. Renee's full name, the pregnancy. A quote from a source described as close to the family, implying the pregnancy had been, the exact phrase was strategically timed. Strategically timed. He found out Oren had traced the leak within 6 hours. Not a peripheral associate, not a business contact making a bet, Adrian. His younger sister, 30 years old, who had sat 3 chairs down the table the night of the family dinner, and who had been present for every significant family conversation for the last decade, and who had smiled at him across rooms for years with the particular expression of someone who believed entirely in the rightness of her own decisions. He called Renee from the car. She answered immediately. The article is still up, she said. Her voice had a temperature he'd never heard from her before. Not the cold control of the kitchen conversation, something rawer underneath it. Women I went to culinary school with are texting me. My sister is getting calls, Theren. My sister. I know. I'm having it taken down now. Tonight? Tonight. The call to the editor took 4 minutes. The Langford name in Boston required no threats. The article came down within the hour. He forwarded Renee the screenshot of the blank page. She sent back 3 words. Thank you, Theren. He was on a flight to Boston before midnight. Adrian answered the door of the Marlborough Street estate in a cashmere robe with a glass of wine, and her expression moved through 3 changes in 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, composed neutrality. He came inside and stood in the foyer where they'd grown up and let the smell of it hit him. Old mahogany, dried garden flowers, 32 years of everything this house had asked of both of them. Tell me, he said, what you thought you were doing. She looked at him with genuine conviction, which was almost worse than guilt. I was protecting us. You were disappearing into South Carolina while the 4th quarter ran without you. Dad is 64. 2 contracts were waiting on your signature. She set her wine down. I moved to accelerate the resolution. You told a journalist the mother of my child manufactured a pregnancy to trap me. I implied. You fabricated a quote about her character and fed it to a blog that named her by full name. His voice stayed even. He had decided before knocking on this door that he was not going to raise it. Not because he wasn't furious, but because fury in this room had always been a signal of weakness, and he was not here to signal weakness. That quote traveled. People she knows read it. Women she went to school with texted her. Her sister spent a morning answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize. He looked at his sister directly. You didn't think about that. Something in Adrian's expression cracked. Not guilt exactly. Something beneath it. The first genuine uncertainty he'd ever seen from her. You decided she was a problem to be solved, he said. You didn't see her as a person. He paused. That's what I taught you, by how I lived, by what I said in that study the night she was standing outside the door. He stopped. I understand the logic, and I'm telling you it's wrong, not strategically, not because it didn't work, because she is a person. He left before she could answer. He was back in Charleston by afternoon, and in Celia's kitchen, he sat down across from Renee and told her what he'd done and what he was going to do next. He separated his personal assets from the family holding structure. He established independent financial arrangements that didn't run through the Langfords. He filed documentation, formal, legal, witnessed, stating that Renee Aldrich and their child were under his personal protection and that any action taken against them by any member of his family was an action taken against him directly. He called her from his attorney's lobby when it was done. It's done, he said. She exhaled slowly. Come back to Charleston, not the hotel, come to the house. He was on a flight by noon. The weeks that followed had a shape he hadn't expected. Not ease, not absolution, just the specific demands of being present to something real. He learned which drawer held the good tea. He learned that Celia took her coffee black and Renee took hers with too much sugar. He drove to every prenatal appointment. He sat in waiting rooms without needing to fill the silence. In February, at 32 weeks, Renee's blood pressure spiked at a routine check, modified bed rest, weekly monitoring, the possibility of early arrival. She heard the news with the expression she used for things she couldn't control, very still, very internal, processing somewhere below the surface. In the car home, she was quiet, then, I don't like this. I know. The not being in charge part. You don't have to be in charge of this one, he said. I'm here. She looked at him with the weighing in her eyes, testing for where the performance started. Then, okay, she said, quietly. He did not get tired. He worked from the house. He learned what she could eat without nausea, which changed week to week and required him to pay close attention and remember without being asked. He drove. He answered when she called. He was simply, consistently there, which turned out to be the thing that mattered most, the thing she had never been able to rely on, and therefore the thing she watched for most carefully. The night Renee went into labor was a Tuesday in March at 34 weeks. He heard her through the wall at 2 a.m, the particular sound of someone moving with intention. He was in the hallway before he'd processed why. She was at the top of the stairs, one hand on the wall, breathing in a way that was controlled and deliberate. How far apart? He said. She looked at him. I don't know yet. Just come. He got the bag from her closet, knocked on Celia's door, said the words clearly. Celia was dressed in 4 minutes. He drove to the hospital. He let the nurses do their work and stayed close enough to be present without being in the way. The labor was long and hard. Renee worked through it without performing anything. No theater of endurance, just the actual thing. At some point in the dark hours of early morning, she reached for his hand without looking at him. She gripped it hard. He held on. She didn't let go after. He didn't mention it. At 5:47 in the morning, his daughter was born. 5 pounds, 9 ounces. She cried immediately, with the committed fullness of someone who had arrived ahead of schedule and intended the room to know it. They placed her on Renee's chest. Renee made a sound he had never heard from her, not in 8 months of knowing her, not in all the months of careful distance that followed, not in any of the conversations or silences in between. The sound of a person hitting the limit of what they can contain and discovering the limit is not where they thought it was. The nurse turned to him. Would you like to cut the cord? He looked at Renee. She was looking back at him, and her face was fully open in a way he had never seen, every layer of management stripped back, just the unmediated truth of what she was feeling, directed at him. She nodded. He cut the cord, and then they placed his daughter in his arms. She was so small, he had understood the data of it. Data is not the same as the physical fact of holding something that weighs less than a bag of flour and carries the weight of everything you have done wrong and everything you are still trying to do right. She was looking at him, not quite at him. The eyes of a newborn are still finding their focus, but in his direction, at his face, at the general fact of him. He was aware, from some distance, that he was crying. He was not performing it. It was simply occurring, the way things occur when the body encounters something that exceeds all available mechanisms. He looked at Renee. She was watching him hold their daughter, and her expression was not yet forgiveness, not yet everything restored, but it was the ground on which those things could stand. The first solid ground in 5 months. "She has your hands," he said. He hadn't planned it. It was just true. Renee looked at their daughter's hands, the tiny closed fists, the improbable fingernails, and said very quietly, "I know." That word, all the distance it carried, all the weight of arriving at a single ordinary sentence. They named her Theren, not short for anything. Renee decided on the second day, lying in the recovery room with the baby on her chest in that particular exhausted clarity that comes after you push through something enormous and come out the other side with your understanding of what matters permanently reorganized. Theren, which meant something like star in another language, something like stillness, though Renee said she'd chosen it because it was the only name that fit without needing to be explained. Theren said it once softly, in the direction of his daughter's sleeping face. It fit. He didn't know exactly why. True things are sometimes like that. The Langford situation remained quiet until April, when his father's attorney sent a letter challenging the February restructuring on procedural grounds. The legal argument was thin. His own attorney dismissed it in 2 paragraphs. But the message was clear. His father was keeping the door open. Renee read his face when he came to the kitchen with the letter. "Family?" she said. "My father. He's challenging the restructuring on a technicality." She poured coffee and sat down. "What do you want to do?" The directness of it. The assumption that his preference mattered and should be stated. He'd stopped taking that for granted. "I want to call him," he said. "Not through lawyers. Just us, in a room. Close this." "Do you think he'll listen?" "I think he might. He's 64 and he's afraid of becoming irrelevant. Everything he's done since February is about staying connected." He paused. "The legal challenge isn't about winning. It's about not being cut off." She was quiet for a moment, then call him. They met at a restaurant in Back Bay they'd been going to since Theren was 16, a place chosen for conversations that required civilian normalcy around them. His father was already there. He stood when Theren came in, and they shook hands, and sat down, and talked around the edges until the plates came and went, and his father set down his coffee and said, "How is she?" "Say her name," Theren said. A pause. "How is Renee?" "She's well. Theren is healthy, 2 months old. She's starting to track faces." His father nodded. He looked at the table for a long moment. "I would like to meet her," he said. "Theren." "That's Renee's decision, not mine." "I understand." And the challenge gets dropped first. His father held his gaze. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, which had never been part of his vocabulary, but something that in another man at another table might have been the beginning of acknowledgement. Then, in a quieter register than Theren had heard from him in years, "She must be worth all of this." Not sarcasm, not a challenge, something underneath both. "She is," Theren said. The legal challenge was dropped within the week. Renee, when he told her, looked at her coffee for a moment and then said, "If he wants to meet Theren, he can come here. One afternoon. Celia has to be home." She paused. "And he uses her name." "He will." She nodded. Then she reached over and adjusted the collar of his jacket, a small automatic gesture, and didn't seem to notice she'd done it until she looked up and found him watching her. She dropped her hand. Then she didn't. Adrian came to Charleston in September. She drove from Boston, 11 hours, which Renee found out afterward was because she'd needed the time to compose what she needed to say. She knocked on a Saturday morning, and Renee answered it. She looked at Theron's sister on the porch. The woman who had sent a lawyer with an envelope, the woman whose fabricated quote had traveled through Renee's network in 48 hours. "I owe you an apology," Adrian said. "That I don't know how to make adequate. I'm going to try anyway." Renee studied her for a moment, then she stepped back from the door. "Come in." Theren stayed in the back garden. He sat on the bench near the rosemary and listened through the screen door. Not the words, just the rhythm. Something that sounded like confrontation. Something that sounded like explanation. A long silence, then something quieter. When Adrian came out to find him, her face had the look of someone who had said necessary things and been neither fully forgiven nor fully absolved, and who understood this was appropriate. "She told me what it was like," Adrian said, reading that article, her sister's phone, women from her past calling. She paused. "I thought about the strategy. I didn't think about that." He looked at his sister. "I know. I'm sorry, plain, without decoration, the kind of sorry that costs something. Working on it," he said, "is the part that matters now." He brought her inside to meet Theren. Renee was in the front room with the baby on the playmat. Adrian sat down on the floor without being asked, the particular leveling that babies perform on adults still carrying armor, and Theren looked at her with the focused assessment of someone cataloging new information. Renee watched this for a moment, then she went to make coffee. October came, 1 year. Renee didn't mark it explicitly. She woke and made coffee and sat at Celia's kitchen table with Theren in her lap and looked out at the rosemary garden going into its fall colors. She was quiet in a way that was different from her usual morning quiet. Theren noticed. He always noticed now. He had trained himself over the months to read the specific gradients of her silences. He sat down across from her with his own coffee and waited. She looked at Theren, then at the counter where the ceramic mugs sat. The one she'd taken out of the cardboard box the week Theren came home from the hospital, the one with the tiny painted stars. She used it every morning now. "I bought that mug a year ago yesterday," she said. He was quiet. "I keep thinking about who I was that afternoon," she said, standing outside the pottery studio before I went in, deciding. She shook her head slightly. She had no idea what was about to happen to her. "Neither did I," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't know what I was yet," he said. "I thought I did. I was wrong." He paused. "I'm less wrong now. That's what I have." She looked at him for a long moment. Theren made a sound between them. A small declarative sound, the kind she made when she felt excluded from a conversation for too long. Renee smiled down at her daughter. Then she looked back at him. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "What you said in February," she said, "when you called from the lobby before you flew back. You said you were doing something, and I said don't do it for me, and you said it wasn't about that." She held his gaze. "Ask me now." He set down his coffee. "Renee," he said, "do you love me?" She sat at Celia Aldrich's kitchen table in October, with their daughter in her lap and the fall light coming through the window, and a year of every single inch between them accounted for in all its days. She looked at him the way she looked at the thing she had decided the full truth about. "Yes," she said. Not an arrival. He understood that immediately. Not resolution or completion or the end of the work. Just one true thing, said plainly, with the full weight of what it had cost to be able to say it. He breathed, nodded once. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "That's all. What else is there?" Something happened in her face then, not the almost smile, not the thing adjacent to it, but the actual thing, the real one, the one she gave to very few people in very few moments, full and unguarded and completely her. Theren reached up from her lap toward the mug on the table, small fingers opening and closing in the direction of the painted stars. Renee lifted her closer and let her touch the ceramic side, warm from the coffee. Theren patted it twice with concentrated seriousness, as though approving of whatever was in the room. Theren watched them both, the morning light, the rosemary beyond the window, his daughter's hand on the mug that had traveled from a Tuesday in Boston through everything that had come after, all the way to this kitchen, to this ordinary morning, to this. He reached across the table and covered Renee's free hand with his. She let him.